information and videos. So just click that got it button and we will be good to go. I just have a couple of points of housekeeping before we get started. Some of you were with us for our coffee and conversation in April, where we focused on the impact that your gifts made in Latin America. This time we're focusing on the war in Ukraine and its far-reaching ripple effects. We have two incredible speakers to share their knowledge with us today. Tamara Demuria, our Chief Humanitarian Officer for Chorus International, and Maryna Hayes, our Senior Manager for Philanthropic Initiatives, who herself is a native of Ukraine. Now, I want the next hour to be really relaxed and conversational, like sitting with your neighbor and sharing a cup of coffee. So we did provide you with the coffee. Most of you should have received a bag of this Mountain Harvest steeped coffee to brew and enjoy during our conversation. This product is being offered by Lutheran World Relief Farmers Market. If you like these cute little coffee bags, our friends at Farmers Market Coffee have provided us this time with a coupon for you to buy any steeped product and get one free now through October 31st. I'm going to be putting the links to that in the chat to provide you more information about the coffee and the offer. Now into a couple of other items. During our conversation today, my colleague Hannah Smith will be here to assist you. So if you need anything or have difficulties at any time, you can put them in the chat box and Hannah will help you. If you don't see the chat on the right side of your screen now, there's a conversation bubble at the bottom of the screen. And if you click it, the chat feed should show up on the right side of your Zoom screen. Now, some of you have already put in where you're joining us today. So if the others want to give it a try and let us know where you're joining us from today, that would be great. Also, if you have any questions or difficulties as we go on through the event, please feel free to post them in the chat and we'll be able to help you better that way. During the next hour, you're going to have the opportunity to have your questions answered by the speakers. To ensure that we can see and hear our speakers as they present, all of your attendees are going to be muted, but we ask that if you have a question during the presentation, please type it in the chat and we're going to collect them and make sure that we get you an answer either live today during the event or as a direct response afterward. You'll also have time to ask a question yourself in a question and answer segment after each of our speakers have finished. And that's all the housekeeping we have. So with that, I am very excited to get us started. I'm going to start with a quick poll question, okay? I'll read it out and I'll give you a minute to read it again and click on your response. Hannah, will you post the poll, please? Our poll is, how did you become a faithful neighbor? Did you, 1, receive a mailing? 2, hear somebody speak at your church? 3, you saw an ad online on social media? 4, you received an email asking you to join? Or 5, other? I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to put in your answers and we'll see. This is great. Looks like we are in a fight between other ways and receiving a mailing. So that's really helpful for us as we move forward and try and grow the program to include other neighbors. All right, so I'm going to end this and we will get moving along. And there's our results. All right, now, moving on to our first speaker for today, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our Chief Humanitarian Officer, Tamara Demuria. Tamara shapes and heads humanitarian assistance at Chorus International, bridging a development approach to the most complex humanitarian crises and looking to leverage and support local capabilities with an eye to recovery, resilience, and lasting impact. Tamara joined Chorus in 2020 from FHI 360, where she served as the Associate Technical Director, Crisis Response and Integrated Development. She brings years of experience leading complex humanitarian and development programs, including at the Danish Refugee Council as interim head of programs for Ethiopia and Djibouti, CARE USA, where she served in multiple roles as a director of practice, partnerships, and innovation, and deputy director of humanitarian strategy. Tamara has spent substantial time working overseas. Over the last decade, she served as deputy country director for Haiti, deputy chief of party for a multi-million-dollar food and nutrition security program, director in the Caucasus, among many other field-based leadership roles. Tamara's achievements and highlights of her career include her nomination as a mobile money partner by USAID, her role in introducing and advancing cash and voucher assistance, including the gender and cash angle at CARE, her partnership work across a network of private sector companies, and a unique sign-off on data sharing principles among 15 NGOs. Tamara holds a master's degree with honors in leading innovation and change from St. John's University in the UK, and a bachelor's degree in public administration from the State Technical University in the Republic of Georgia. Tamara, we now hand it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you may be time zone wise. It's my pleasure to be with you today and spend this hour discussing what we're doing to support the crisis in Ukraine, how your invaluable contributions are enabling us to extend the program to the most needed people. So I would love to start off with extreme gratitude, both on behalf of the team that was able to mount the response within a very short period of time, but also every single Ukrainian that is still receiving the support. And I will go through what that looks like, not only in Ukraine, but also in Poland. So huge thanks to all of you. Without your contributions, this would not have been possible. And every cent, not even a dollar, counts when it comes to rapidity, scalability, and ability to do anything in humanitarian crisis, particularly of this magnitude. I will start off by saying that Karen read out a lot of things that I've done in my professional career. And I think what was happening in Ukraine particularly touched my heart, because I originally am from Republic of Georgia. Those of you that know a little bit of history, this has been a similar quite a complex conflict and war-related situation as well a couple of years ago, back in '92, as well as the most recent in 2008. So back then, we did not necessarily have Twitter, information channels that you use now. So a lot of this was never really surfacing at the same magnitude. What started happening in Ukraine was particularly sensitive to me because I had family, I had friends, I had very close ties to the country on social as well as professional levels from my previous experiences. So it was a no-brainer for me to look at it, given also that I could speak certain languages that facilitated the ease of communication. What was really important to understand, and even at times very hard for us as the team to accept, that we are now responding to a humanitarian crisis of a significant magnitude in European countries. In countries where the cost of living as well as the level of development was significantly different than compared to some of the other parts of the world where we have presence. Programs where we probably had more liberty to influence certain ways of implementing emergency response in other parts of the world became quite heavily limited and needed to be coordinated with the European government in Poland, with the government of Ukraine, which had always taken pride in quite a significant level of digital development. So here we are, international organizations and Lutheran World Relief in particular, up against a huge challenge where, if compared to other parts of the world where rural response to humanitarian crisis is a little easier to manage, you're looking at a high-rise building with multiple hundreds of apartments and people that have lost homes overnight, or thousands of mothers fleeing with their children to their own, to other parts of their own country or across the border, not necessarily having the language, becoming the victims of human trafficking. And unfortunately, yes, in humanitarian crisis, ugly things scale up, and including gender-based violence or any other type of violence is what we're seeing on extreme rise. And this was a huge concern for us as the team, as well as other organizations that we were partnering with, including the local Ukrainian organizations. So it was a challenge. It was a challenge where to start. And I think this is where the beauty of our relationships, and particularly Lutheran relationships across the world, were of a huge importance. So your contributions were not just supporting the implementation of any type of humanitarian activity, but also really reinforcing our local partners, the churches on the European side, to be able to work with the flow of people, the waves and waves of refugees, particularly coming into Poland. They also fled to other countries, but our partnerships and ties were stronger in Poland, and that's where close to 7 million people. I think Poland is what the most recent number is being hosted in terms of the refugees. Even to date, there's a significant percentage that stays there. So what we have tried to do is put this resource to a greater use in terms of working with the local capacities, local organizations, so that they would drive the response and not the international society, which is usually the typical approach in many humanitarian crises. You have UN, you have some other international organizations parachuting in, driving a lot of this decision-making activities on the ground, and very often the local organizations and local civil society groups, women's groups, and so on and so forth are left out from the process. We took a little bit of a different approach. We were deliberately inclusive and framed our response through the local partners just to enable their sustainable ability to manage and cope with the disaster, as well as offer the traditional approaches that would be acceptable and within the legal frameworks of the countries that they knew much better than the outsiders coming in to provide that extra help. In Poland, we started distributing cash. Why cash and not items? During the first days I visited Poland, and particularly the border areas, you would see piles of clothes, piles of non-food items, hygiene kits, anything from toothbrushes to soaps to you name it. Some other things related to baby, infant, children's, anything from toys to personal items and things like that. These were piles, and the local volunteers in particularly were struggling, sorting through and making sure that they were appropriate for the weather, for the conditions, for the needs of the incoming refugees. And this is where international community, including us as part of it, Lutheran World Relief as part of the broader international community responding to humanitarian crisis, we were compelled to continuously message to donate funds, to donate money, because this would, first of all, be invested in the local economy and purchase items that are available, context and tradition specific, acceptable, and signed off for broader use by the refugees on the ground, and also cutting the cost of importing things, because you can imagine those piles and piles of boxes or bales are not ending up there out of nowhere. It is a heavy logistical arrangement behind it, including the cost, which cuts it down further to be the resource spent on the actual recipients, such as refugees or internally displaced people. So there was a huge advocacy to really limit it to the in-kind donations, although in-kind donations, of course, at a very early stage played its role and were absolutely spot on and acceptable. But now, as the situation continues, we are in constant realization of the fact that the markets turn around and somehow they develop that agility. Businesses find ways to continue performing financial transactions, to continue performing within the existing or even newly created supply chains. Things that you would think are no longer available, somehow these corporate and private sector representatives really use that for the opportunity of building the new client base and create the services that are required for the country, for the host countries such as Poland, Hungary, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it is really the buying capacity of these people that have lost their jobs, that do not have ability to access the land, to cultivate it, to plant anything. And unfortunately, we're seeing at least 30% of the agricultural land inaccessible in Ukraine because of the heavy mining. Even if the Russian forces retract and Ukrainian forces take over some of the occupied territories, there's a heavy demining operation happening before anyone is even allowed to get close to it. Does that guarantee 100% clearance of the area? Not really. We're constantly risking our own lives as well as the local population, unfortunately, falls victim to some of the unexploded ordinances. And how this becomes a critical consideration for implementing anything beyond just life-saving operations. We're talking about pretty heavy reliance on humanitarian aid in some of the parts of the population right now. They're looking up to the international organizations to provide the basics for their living, and particularly those that are in the occupied territories or have just recently been liberated. I had a chance of looking through some of the questions that were shared ahead of time as you were registering, and thank you for sending those in. There was one question about what does that mean in terms of liberated areas and expanding those geographies? Well, that means that we're following that map and expanding our programmatic reach. Obviously, there's a limit as to how much we can do, both in terms of resources. They're not tangible beyond the capacity of what becomes a meaningful humanitarian assistance, obviously, but we're also cognizant of the fact that with the changing dynamics, there are more and more groups of people that have never had a chance of being supported. And particularly with the very harsh winter, it is a huge concern for the Lutheran World Relief team members, as well as other colleagues across international organizations, that some of the winterization preparedness is simply not happening. There are shortages or expected shortages of electricity and gas across different parts of the country, particularly in the east. There was a question about what does that mean for the western part of Ukraine. Well, imagine one day you wake up to 200,000 people more living in your own city. What does that mean in terms of stranded services, traffic, rent, cost of living, cost of goods in the shops? Obviously, a lot of that becomes a burden, not just for those that have been displaced, not once but twice, but also for the host communities. A lot of the families were sheltered by their friends and extended family members. We were hearing stories as the internally displaced persons were saying, well, I probably will need to vacate that room pretty soon because I don't think I can count on that hospitality for months, if not years. There's a limit to my dignity of being completely dependent on that family, as well as their ability and economic options to take me in as an extra mouth to feed. So fortunately, because the war is still ongoing and we're 7 months into it, time flies, and it's just so hard to accept the reality. There is still quite a big struggle of what happens to those that are seeking shelter, housing options, particularly the population that has lost everything. They're still living in collective centers. You will find them anywhere in hotels that have been used in pre-war times as the rehabilitation, physical therapy centers, the rejuvenation centers, to sports halls and kindergartens. There are families that are squatted in the same room, and they just do not have an option but to go anywhere else in more dignified conditions. That is also where the international community is somewhat limited to drive the decision, because it has to add up to the capacity of the government to cope with it in the longer run. So there are a lot of ongoing consultations with the representatives of different ministries, as well as with the higher representatives from UN structures and across the international community, to find solutions together. We all know that a million or even a few is not enough to reconstruct the country, and the damage is yet to be accounted for. We're looking at significant shortfalls and significant situation where the conditions are just not helpful to recover and see those families through. As a couple of last points, just to highlight the fact, we were seeing a lot of the concerns from the female internally displaced and refugees, reporting significant increase in cases of gender-based violence. As I mentioned earlier, cases of human trafficking. What have we been doing for that? We have been very actively working in both equipping them with the informational knowledge where they can seek further help if unfortunate cases like that occurred, where they can get more complex approach and support, ranging from medical attention to psychological attention. Mental health was also number one and remains to be a number one problem across these different groups, both displaced within the country as well as the refugees. And moreover, we've been working very closely with all of our local partners, and local partners being the civil society organizations, to ensure that they know how to recognize the signs. They hold awareness campaigns and sessions. They work very closely to destigmatize specific support, in addition to much broader programming, such as paying the subsidy for their rent, doing the rotational medical services, which were completely disrupted or unavailable in certain parts of the country, or largely overwhelmed because of the influx of hundreds of thousands of people to certain other parts of the country. I think as a couple of other points before I hand over for any additional questions or clarification from Karen, it is a longer term protracted crisis as we're looking at it right now. We all hoped this war would end. I'm no way a political analyst to predict anything, unfortunately. Are we looking at some very harsh decisions or moves from the aggressor in this case and in this conflict? Yes, we are. Does that look like being resolved anytime soon? It is a little hard question to answer definitively. I think we're all witnessing that this has been a critical priority for particularly the American government, European governments, which are also largely affected by some of the other consequences, and not only by other governments as well, because the ripple effects of the Ukraine war, that is the largest producer of grain and sunflower oil, are felt as far as in Lebanon, Yemen, Burkina Faso, and so on and so forth. What does that mean? That means hunger for people. That means an inability to produce alternative crops to replace what they were used to in terms of their feeding practices, and that change does not happen overnight. And that means instability, insecurity, and other negative coping strategies adopted by already vulnerable population. So Lutheran World Relief has presence in multiple countries around the world, and we're seeing the impact of that already, and are discussing with the U.S. government, the senators, and on the Hill to really take into consideration some of the foreign strategies and funding strategies when it comes to Ukraine support, because it is not just Ukraine, unfortunately, and the magnitude is massive and it's worldwide. I will pause here just to allow for some of the other inputs. Karen, if you have any other questions that you would like me to focus on, but Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure leading the team. I am personally leading the team in Ukraine. I'm traveling there for a month now to spend even more time with the local staff and expand our reach beyond existing programs and existing geographies. We cover pretty much 70% of the country. You can't be everywhere at 100%, but we do have a pretty strong geographic and programmatic coverage. And it's just a huge thank you from everyone, and including our beneficiaries, people that have felt your support very tangibly and have been feeling and will feel it even over the next couple of months going into 2023. So for some, it will be a rough Christmas period, but trust me, it would have been even worse without your support. So thank you. Thank you so much for all of what you've done.
Thank you so much, Tamara. It's so important to look at the big picture, and that this is, this could continue to go on, and how it's affecting people around the world, things that we don't necessarily think of, right? So now is the time where any of you could ask questions. And if you would like to type a question into the chat, or if you would like to use the raise your hand button in the reactions bar at the bottom, please feel free to do that now, and we will recognize you to ask a question. Tamara, I have a question from someone that sent it before. We have a question from Mary, who says, who are some of the partnering agencies that LWR works with, and how are these agencies selected?
Fantastic question, Mary. Thank you for asking that. So in Poland, for instance, we partnered with the Lutheran World Federation, which is a Europe-based Lutheran organization, and they have access to hundreds of parishes across the country that we're managing the refugee registration and enrollment centers. What that means is when you arrive as a refugee, you get ushered into the center to take your personal data, if available, or somehow identify you as the refugee so that you can qualify for assistance, be it cash transfers, any of the non-food items and packages that may have been awaiting for you, and so on and so forth, be enrolled in the Polish social safety net system. So that was the primary angle as to how we used our Lutheran connections in Poland. In Ukraine, we've really expanded that to be more of a targeted partnership with the local organizations. For example, we used the professional unions network. In any country, you would agree, in some countries particularly, they are quite numerous and very well represented, and the membership is really, really high. We had access to the hotels that the professional trade union manages, where all of these internally displaced people were sheltering right after the war and continue to live there. We have served close to 10,000 people over the last couple of months, providing them with hot meals a day, as well as looking at the cost of living, subsidizing their rent. Otherwise, they were not able to rent anything, having lost all of their assets. We continue to support them to maintain their presence until they figure out, together with the government, as well as us with other partners, how to relocate them and where to move them. In addition to this, we are also very actively working on the mobile health service provision. And imagine this is minivan that is packed with professional doctors of different specialties. And because the health facilities were bombed or destructed or dysfunctional or looted during the war, this medical team, with whatever the minimal equipment they require, obviously there is a limitation as to how much you can do, is going around visiting the collective centers where people are sheltered, as well as providing this to the host community, because the impact of healthcare access was not just limited to the displaced. It was heavily felt by those that were hosting the hundreds of thousands of IDPs, the internally displaced persons as well. So we have a local partner that specializes in medical services and has been doing that as part of the broader health reform in Ukraine. We worked together on a program design and basically agreed on how how they would roam around these different locations, roving the healthcare services to affected population, and what would that mean in terms of their ability to reach the most inaccessible parts of the country in dire need, for example. I hope that answered your question.
We have a question from Roland who says, what is your monthly budget need and how does that compare to what is coming in?
Great question. I think I'll start by prefacing that the limit is in how much you can cover and how many people you can serve. Right now, we were lucky, and with the support of people like you, as well as some of the other major donors, we were absolutely grateful to raise about 12 million plus, a little bit above $12 million. Right now, because of the magnitude of the need, because of the high cost of operating in European countries, we're able to operate for a couple of months into 2023, serving around 5,000 people. How many people are in total displaced and or in dire need of humanitarian assistance? 12 million. What does that mean? It varies from health to education needs. Children are out of school in some of the places because all the parents have is a cracked smartphone. Not everyone even ran with the computers or iPads or any other type of tablets. They really struggle because of the psychological impact to focus on any kind of schooling and education, even if it is virtual. So right now, I think if we wanted to expand our reach, we're definitely looking at more funds and working very closely on soliciting that from the institutional donors, which means U.S. government donors, donor agencies that are issuing funding, which is competitive. And obviously, this does not guarantee that everyone gets the piece of that funding. And sometimes the decisions made by the government are not necessarily always equitable either. So if I may say, the monthly budget is a little bit of a hard figure to point at, but I will say overall our 2-year mark is $12 million. If I had the opportunity to program more, there is huge need and tremendous recognition of lack of certain capacities across the country. And if I had at least 1/3 of that in addition, it would enrich the program over the next year by introducing some of the early livelihoods recovery options. For example, working with the agricultural farmers, the producers to procure seeds, which are now in shortage, to import things that they cannot produce locally anymore. A lot of that is still coming. Whereas I said, looking as a global response capacity to save lives, but those lives also need to plan ahead. It's not just a bread today or a fish today. And we're really cognizant that this recovery programming, the early recovery hasn't even started. So more money, more ability to impact people, increased number of beneficiaries can fall into our program. And definitely there's a huge recognition and request to continue the support while the war is ongoing. Unfortunately, until this is resolved, we probably won't have the final answer as to what the future holds for Ukrainians. But right now, we're quite understaffed and underfunded, even though millions sound like a huge amount of money. The cost of living is not the same as it is in Yemen, for example. So it is definitely harder to tick the box of how much can be spent to extrapolate that to the larger number of people benefiting from it.
That's great. We do have some other questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, we're going to move ahead with the program. But know that if you have another question in the chat, we will get you an answer. So please don't worry. We are going to, we will respond to all the questions that we have. So Tamara, thank you so much for all of your insight and all of the amazing work that you do. Yeah, know that we appreciate it every day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks again. I will try to get some of the answers answered in the questions answered in the chat as well. I will stay on and we'll review what came in. So if possible, I can definitely get those answers.
Wonderful.
Well. Thank you.
you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our second speaker today, our Senior Manager for Philanthropic Initiatives, Maryna Hayes. Maryna is a proven strategic expert in the areas of international education, international development, program and project management, and event coordination. She believes in the power of education, entrepreneurship, and philanthropy to create solid social and economic value. Her strong multilingual and communication skills, together with international experience, enable her to bridge cross-cultural issues and find easy, friendly ways to cooperate in a multicultural environment. As program manager, she managed numerous medical research projects at the Henry M. Jackson Foundation for the advancement of military medicine. By providing exceptional program management services, she executed international educational programs sponsored by the U.S. Department of State and organized by Legacy International, empowering young leaders around the world. Maryna executed public education campaigns and trainings on newly adopted legislations for USAID projects in Ukraine, worked on implementation of innovative marketing strategies in Sweden, and developed Ukrainian-Polish cooperation within international projects in Poland. Currently, Maryna serves as Senior Program Manager for Philanthropy Initiatives at Chorus International, empowering a global family of changemakers and supporting initiatives and programs aimed to make the world flourishing in dignity and justice. Maryna, I now hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me to join you for Coffee Hour event. And honestly, I cannot be more grateful for the timing of this event, as it allows us to share current update with you and the important work we're doing in Ukraine, Poland, and around the globe. And again, I will probably echo some Tamara's points, right? That your generosity and the generosity of other donors allowed us to raise over $12 million, and the number is growing every day. And it does help us to share God's love with our neighbors in and from Ukraine. As Karen mentioned, and you probably sensed, right, I'm Ukrainian myself. I was born and raised in Ukraine, and this Russian invasion directly affected my family and my friends. And I believe it's not just another war. It is a tragedy of a modern world and independent European country where my own family is fighting for the freedom, for their independence. Since the war started, Lutheran World Relief, thanks to donors and their generosity and kindness, been able to provide all sort of support to Ukrainians in Poland and Ukraine. I was blessed to be one of the very first members who went to Ukraine and Poland as well. And the very beginning, it was the first needs assessment and emergency response trip to Poland, where we mostly spent our time at the border, supporting Ukrainians. And what I saw, I wish I could unseen it. Ukrainians, mostly young women with children, they were terrified, disoriented, distressed. Their eyes were fixed on literally nothing, and face expression was withdrawn, and some barely holding their tears, right? Those were the reflection of suffering generated by war. But it was just the beginning of a story. Displacement and trauma was a very high risk of abuse and exploitation that have myriad impacts on their health and well-being during this war and beyond. And Hannah, if you please show the first slide of the presentation, I want to introduce Marta to you. She was one of the first Ukrainians I met. She arrived with her 3 children. In this picture, she's holding the youngest one, her 4-year-old son. At that very moment, she was incredibly vulnerable, alone with her children, still in shock after fleeing her war-torn home, right, and facing an entirely different reality, that growing threat of human trafficking and sex trafficking. But most of all, I think, as well as my own sister, twin sister, had to leave the country with her 2 children, they all were afraid of uncertainty and what's next. how long they will be able to sustain their children. As you know, many women, Ukrainian women who were arriving in Poland and other countries as refugees, they found themselves living on the margins without local contacts, without language skills, job opportunities that would enable them to provide for their children. They left their home, their families, their beloved husbands, in order to save the future of Ukraine, their own children. And as my sister confessed, as well as Marta, as many other Ukrainians, right? They have this ongoing questions like what's next and how long we'll be able to provide for our kids, how long our savings will last, a month, a week, how much longer we'll be able to push those 100 days back. Lutheran World Relief reacted momentarily to this incredibly growing fast need for cash and of course protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. And as Tamara mentioned, LWR integrated protection services for refugees, women and children into cash programming. There was a referral system in place where Ukrainians who would go to get funds for their families at those cash distribution centers would be redirected to other facilities if any additional help would be needed. Like for example, if they experience or live through physical abuse, sexual violence, they also could have received. They were also able to receive some psychological support on site. And next slide, please. For Marta, and as well as for Helena, the next one more slide, Hannah, thank you. Helena, she also, as Marta arrived, was her two children, Nadia and Vladimir, and Vladimir, I believe, was like 11 years old. For them, the cash that they received from Lutheran World Relief was the only source they could help their children, they could sustain their children, provide food for their children, but also keep their spirit and their hope high and continue believing in the human kindness and generosity. And as you know, we all know, if you have hope, anything is possible. But LWR continued looking for the ways to reach as many as possible, especially those who were losing their hope, those who were not able to flee the country or have immediate access to medical supplies or food. Next slide, please. As Tamara mentioned, we went to several facilities in Ukraine. We subsidize the cost of living and food and medical supplies in those facilities. They are not meant to, but this day they shelter Ukrainians, those who had to flee from eastern part or southern part of Ukraine. In particular, in one of those facilities, I met the Neil. She is in her mid-80s, and Tatiana, she's in early 80s. Both those ladies they survived the Second World War. They survived now Russian attacks, heavy shelling. They lost their houses, and instead of peaceful retirement right now, right, they're facing terrifying reality. They were telling us horrifying stories of bombing and the loss of their friends and neighbors. And it's incredibly difficult to hear it, especially when those beautiful seniors, right, were barely holding their tears. They shared their main pain and fears of not having a warm and safe place to go back to. And that place is called home. But thanks to your generosity and your kindness, Neil and Tatiana, they have a temporary home, a warm place where LWR continues subsidizing the cost of living in those centers. Next slide, please. We also channel killed and kid inventory to these facilities, bringing the light of hope and the warmth of your kindness and support to many, many Ukrainians. Within just these 3 months, we reached 64,000 Ukrainians. And on this picture, you can see Alexandra, was her two children. Nadia, she just turned 12, I believe, and her 2 years old Kirilo. But also, Alexandra became a mother for the third time. And since the war started, Ukrainians have experienced this shortage of food, clothes, hygiene products, and whatnot. And not surprisingly, Alexandra could not find clothes for her newborn baby. It is really hard to describe the level of joy and the level of gratitude and happiness when she was unveiling those kids and pulling out the baby clothes. It's just, the gift was priceless and very much needed for Nadia as well as for many others. And right now she's staying in the facility that are not even aimed for long time usage, and they are not equipped to accept mothers with little babies. I'm not talking about even for labors, right? Next slide, please. And miracles continue happening, and I call them born free. The Katerina, she was 8 months pregnant when they have to leave their home in Propasna. It's a small town in Kharkiv region. Of course, the town was completely destroyed, demolished by Russian army. But being heavily pregnant, she delivered a healthy baby whom they named Victoria as they wait for the victory of Ukraine. And Katerina, what she said deeply touched me. She said, right now, we're all together. And this is the most important thing. Everyone is alive. Yes, there is no place to live. Our town is in ruins, but we hope that we will rebuild everything and we will be back. I think it speaks volume about strong Ukrainian spirit and desire to rebuild their future for the sake of their own children. Next slide, please. And as well as Katerina was her family, Ludmila also waits the victory, was her granddaughter. Her granddaughter is unfortunately disabled, and was the start of the war. She lost all the medical support and assistance she used to receive before the war. And both of them had to flee Kharkiv when it was heavily bombarded. And what Ludmila shared with us was just heartbreaking. She said that the most difficult thing is to see your children lying on the floor inside the bomb shelter. The sound of explosion, the sight of confused people running around. You don't know where to run, and you don't know where to hide, what to do, how it will end, whether all this is really happening. It is really scary when children, elderly, innocent, dying. And you don't know if your children are going to make it. It is terrifying. It's scary because missiles are still flying and you just don't know where they're going to land. Once you have heard it and seen that, it is scary to face that again. And we know that a lot of people left Kharkiv and a lot of them returned back, but then had to leave and flee again because it was just impossible to comprehend and even to accept the fact that Russia continued, the attacks continued, the shelling continues, the bombing continued. What I would love to share with you is that during our interview, when we sat down with Ludmila and her granddaughter, Ludmila continued calming her granddaughter, constantly, telling her everything is okay, everything is fine. And it's just, it was just heartbreaking to see how we all were barely holding the tears. And Yaroslava, she been severely traumatized by the events that she had to live through. And in as much as food and clothes, there is a huge need for psychological support. Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of Ukrainian children have suffered and still suffering the shelling, the shooting, this tremendous psychological trauma. And since the Russian invasion began, millions of Ukrainians and Ukrainian children, right, they had to abandon their home, their toys, their friends, their fathers. They have been forced to live in this tiny bomb shelters in a basement, refugee facilities. What's really shocking is when 5-year-old can identify the sound of the type of the bomb and shelling or the missile by its sound. They keep paint and draw only fights, and most of their painting are red, just picturing the bomb explosion or death. And is that what the child deserves? Is it what the childhood should look like? The other day when I was talking to my sister, I was really shocked to hear that my 5-year-old nephew got very excited and he was screaming, "Mama, let's go for a walk," because the siren just went off. It's just, it's unbelievable. But how much more time will it take for him and other children to forget the sound of those sirens, the sounds of shooting? And I'm not even talking about those poor who witnessed the deaths of their parents, their siblings, who became a victim of sexual abuse and violence. And if there is a hope for them, and how can we help heal them and find peace and love in their heart? How many children around the world need to suffer because of the war? And how many needs to suffer because they don't have food on their table? Do you know the price of Ukrainian bread? It's Ukrainian life. Next slide, please. You know that Ukraine is the fourth largest producer of wheat, barley, corn. And this year, Ukrainians were able to utilize about 60 to 70% of its fields just to grow grains. But now Ukraine is struggling not just to collect the harvest, but to preserve. Because what Russian army is doing, they're strategically targeting the fields. Next slide. And when explosion is happening, you can see it goes on fire. But also they're targeting the storages and the places where Ukrainians try to preserve the harvest. Next slide. In these days, the many farmers, they sacrifice their life to protect the wheat, so Ukrainian, African, Asian children, they have a bread on their table. And next slide. As it was mentioned at the beginning of this event, Ukraine also is the largest producer of a sunflower oil. And the ripple effect is hard to describe. And as you know, Asia, especially Indian cuisine, they heavily depend on sunflower oil. A lot of African countries were importing Ukrainian sunflower oil. Even popular American brand Martin Snacks, they also affected by this war. The difficulty right now is that the crush plants in Ukraine have largely shut down, and there is just no oil that being produced or being exported. But also sunflower is a national symbol for Ukrainians, symbol of optimism. And now it just became a symbol of resistance. As much as the world needs Ukrainian grain, corn, sunflower oil, Ukrainians need support to keep their spirits high and also to continue fighting for their freedom, but also to rebuild their faith as they rebuild their own country. I would like to thank you for the ways that you are bringing healing and love to Ukrainians, to my family, to our neighbors around the world. Lutheran World Relief could not do this, what we're doing, if we were not doing it together. For the past half a year working with this organization, right, I learned something very important, that for the work that we're doing, we need to do it together, and especially for us to work together in this time of crisis, like the war in Ukraine, like the flood in Afghanistan, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and we can, go on. And there is the kind of work that we need each other for. And again, thank you so much for all that you do. And we're all so honored to be your partners and so grateful for your generosity.
Thank you so much, Maryna. It's really good to get your perspective. It just makes us feel like we really, have some amazing insight into what's going on. We have time. We are running. We're running a little bit late, but we're going to stay on if it's all right with all of you to answer a few questions. And this is actually a really good question that Maryna, you could help answer. Tamara, if you could help answer as well, that would be great. Tamara asks, how can we explain to others how LWR's work is unique in the midst of so many agencies trying to help?
Fantastic question. You guys are really tough, asking very valid questions. I'm impressed, and it makes my job very hard to be ready to provide you with that answer. But I think the easiest way is to explain that LWR is defaulting to working and enabling local organizations, some of the faith-based networks that are quite unique. Many organizations can claim that they have local partners or identify local organizations easily and work through them, but faith connections are not always the same for every organization. And this is quite a unique angle that we are blessed to have, supported by people like you in other countries, and being true to the commitment. And this is one of the largest sort of networks that we default to if we need to activate locally driven response. So that's one part of the answer. Second, we're looking at the lasting solutions and not just a life-saving approach. Obviously, we time it and we phase it when necessary and as necessary. You can't necessarily talk about what will happen in 5 years when you have bombs exploding next to you. So it is a little bit of a sequential programming, but at the same time, we enter and we respond to humanitarian crisis with the intent to see those communities rebuild their lives back and better, not necessarily abandoning them by having distributed required food or non-food items, but understanding, lobbying, and working on the longer term solutions, be it economic growth or other types of development opportunities. So it is a little bit of a unique angle of pooling the technical resources across multiple parts of the organization. We have specialists that have done multi-million-dollar programs, very complex responses in health. We have specialists that operate and still support and accompany the programs in agriculture, economic development, cocoa production, and things like that. We have experts that look at water sanitation issues and offer lasting solutions. And I think the comprehensive and integrated approach to the disaster response, humanitarian in nature, be it man-made or natural disaster, is where we feel we have 360 solutions and offer beyond just a particular technical approach or a technical sector that we specialize in. And I think that is really different. It is a differentiating factor. Even if in a given country we've only done agricultural programs, it takes us a split of a second to bring in other parts of the organization that specialize in health, if that is the key need identified during the crisis. I hope I did justice to all of the hard work of our team in different parts of the world that is heavily supported by people like you. So thank you.
Jeff is asking, how do you let it be known that we are doing all of this because of God's love?
We accompany all of our work with relevant branding, as well as messages and some of the human stories that we receive from our donors like you. In every conversation with the refugees or internally displaced people, we are sharing who is behind it, because they see us on the front line, and they also need to know now, and we try to do justice to all of the support that we gather from people like you to make sure that message gets across, that there are people behind every quilt, every kit that has been put together, every dollar that is raised to fund medical services, to pay for their housing, for all the other types of purchases or programming options that we offer in response to the needs. We start our meetings with that. We discuss and make sure this is part of the marketing, PR, branding, you name it, as well as in some formal and informal conversations, we're your messengers, basically trying to represent the goodwill, the God's will across so many countries, not just in Ukraine. There are great ways to share your stories, your questions, your interest. Feel free to reach out to my colleagues that are your connecting points and relationship managers. We'll be more than happy to extend those messages, because in early days of war in Ukraine in particular, I was blessed to carry a few messages that we received from the individual donors like you. And as I was representing LWR and explaining what is the support we're bringing, I could also say this comes from people like, naming those that had to share encouragement messages and some of the hope that was traveling across the ocean together with me and my team. So feel free to do that. We'll be more than happy to spread your love.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you, Maryna and Tamara, for everything that you're doing and for really coming here and helping us understand the situation in a new fresh light. We're going to start wrapping up, but know that if you have any other questions, or if there was any other questions that we did not answer, please feel free to send them along to me. I will be sending an email with the recording of the event, and you can respond directly back to me if you have any questions or anything. There's also a video that I'm going to send, a thank you video that I'm going to send in that email that has, some of the people that Maryna shared speaking as well. So I think that's going to be good. Here's the thing: we're able to respond to these crises and these devastating situations because of you, because of you're our faithful neighbors. You're our most generous and compassionate people who give month after month, so that we're able to respond quickly, that we're able to mobilize and help people when they need it as quickly as we can. And we are so grateful to all of you. And you are the heart and soul of our organization, and we appreciate you so much. Thank you very, very much. Carol in the chat had asked if we could finish with the Lord's Prayer, which I think for anyone that wants to join us is a wonderful idea. And Carol said that she would lead it. If Hannah, could you unmute everyone? All right, so Carol, if you would like to lead us, that would be great.
It would be my pleasure. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, ever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you again to Tamara and Maryna Thank you to Hannah, who was our technical guru for this event. Don't forget, we have a coupon for you for
Karen, we can't hear you. You got muted.
I got muted. Oh,
yes, sorry.
So if you have any questions, I will be sending an email with the coupon for your Mountain Harvest coffee. And if you have any questions about this or anything else, please feel free to reach out to me. And for all of us at LWR, thank you all so much. We are so grateful, and have a wonderful rest of your day. God bless you.